Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up in the programme, in the context of tensions over tariffs, we examine the state of relations between India and the United States. Plus, we speak to the former Lebanese MP Marwan Hamadeh and ask him if he's optimistic about the direction his country is heading in. Hello and welcome. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in China, where he's been attending a Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit being held in the city of Tianjin. Well, also in attendance, the Russian President Vladimir Putin and other world leaders. Well, Prime Minister Modi emphasized India's commitment to improving ties with China during talks with President Xi Jinping. That's a message delivered against the backdrop of shared tensions with the United States. Well, this visit marks Prime Minister Modi's first trip to the country since 2018, after years of strained relations following deadly clashes along their shared Himalayan border. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Rakesh Sood, who is the former Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of India in Washington, also India's former ambassador to France, Afghanistan and Nepal. And Ambassador, I gather you're currently a distinguished fellow at the Council for Strategic and Defence Research, a New Delhi-based think tank. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I mean, when you look at the pictures coming out of China and you see Prime Minister Modi there at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I mean, it's not new, India's membership. India joined that organization in 2017. But do you get the impression India has taken this relationship up a level?
Well, not really. I think that summits always have a lot of spectacle and photo ops among the leaders and things like that. So, you know, they always grab eyeballs. That's obviously the purpose of summits. And I think this particular summit taking place in China, which Modi is going to now, he's visiting after 7 years, because his last visit to China was in 2018. And after 2020, though he has met Xi Jinping at other multilateral events, he has not had a visit to China. So in that sense, the significance is of a visit to China, while the boundary issue is still not fully settled, I would say. Okay, so fences are being mended, is that fair to say, between yes. New Delhi and Beijing? Let me put it like this. I think the relationship went into a freeze in 2020. The relationship has begun to thaw, and that thaw began last year when Xi Jinping and Modi met in Kazan in Russia, because at that time the disengagement process of the troops on the line of actual control had been completed. So that's where the thaw began. And right now you are seeing that thaw in evidence. Now, whether this leads to a warming up of the relationship or not, I think we'll have to wait and see. But when you listen to some of the rhetoric coming out of that summit in China, you've got the Indian Prime Minister there, Narendra Modi, hearing from his hosts that the global international situation is ever more chaotic and intertwined, to quote the Chinese President Xi Jinping, who was also talking about bullying behavior from certain countries. How much of a chord do you think all of that is striking with your Prime Minister? Well, once again, I think Prime Minister Modi has, currently he's going through a bit of a difficult time in the relationship with the United States because of all the tariffs and things like that. But at the same time, I do not think that there is any great desire to get drawn into what is called the axis of resistance, which is basically China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Even though we have good relations with Russia, we have good relations with Iran, and we also have a resident embassy in Pyongyang. Okay, so clearly India wants to have it in every way, wants to maintain ties with every country. Well, this is what we have always maintained is as a sovereign decision. And earlier it used to be in a bipolar world, it used to go under the name of non-alignment. And then today it goes under the name of strategic autonomy.
I want to pick up on something you wrote in the Hindustan Times last month. And you sort of cast your mind back to 6 months ago when President Trump and Prime Minister Modi were calling each other great friends. I just want to ask you how much you think things have changed during these last 6 months.
Well, you know, one thing is that President Trump is nothing if not unpredictable. And I think various leaders have seen that. Now, Prime Minister Modi fancies himself as a strong leader, you know, and cut in the same mold as, let's say, Xi Jinping or, say, Putin or Erdogan or, you know, people like that. So I guess where President Trump is coming from is two things. Frankly, I don't think the tariffs are about trade imbalance or about India's purchase of oil from Russia. The tariffs are to do because President Trump feels let down, that India has not supported his claim to the Nobel Peace Prize when he has said more than 30 times that the US played a role and he played a role in bringing about cessation of hostilities between India and Pakistan and thereby preventing a nuclear war. So, and that is a claim that has been strongly denied by India. And that's where the tariff and the Russia thing comes in.
Okay, so there are a couple of factors at work. Is that what you're saying? The tariffs are one of them, but one of the other factors has been a perception that perhaps President Trump isn't portraying that India-Pakistan crisis in an honest light. And President Trump is upset that Prime Minister Modi isn't championing him for a Nobel Peace Prize. Does that roughly sum up where we are?
Well, yes. I think also there is a bit of a rude shock in Delhi in the sense that the India-US relationship has been shifting gradually. I mean, the basic opening began with the end of the Cold War in 1990s. But the shift in India-US relationship post-Cold War has always had geopolitical drivers. And because the geopolitical drivers were well placed, they were well supported by the diplomats and so on, it required a fair bit of heavy lifting by the leaders. And there has been a consistent improvement in that. Now, that led to a growth in bilateral trade, that led to a growth in defense relationships, that led to a growth in terms of technology, that also helped when the Quad came into being in the Indo-Pacific, and so on. Now, the geopolitical driver seems to be missing, and therefore one issue has become a kind of a defining issue. And that is something which is leading to this unhappy realization about reliability. And that has become the kind of debating point in Delhi.
Yeah, in your article, you say that at the time of the start of President Trump's second term, so back in January of this year, the Indians were some of the most optimistic people in the world about that second term. Where do things stand now, do you think?
Oh, today, it is true. At that time, an opinion poll had been taken, I forget by which organization, and it was felt that the highest sort of level of support about that Trump would be good for India-US relationship. That kind of a thing was very high in India compared to anywhere else in Europe or anywhere else in Asia. Today, I think the mood is a little bit has changed. And as I said, a lot of people are questioning how reliable the United States is. But then I think this is what happens when you allow personalities to dominate diplomacy. I mean, diplomacy is driven by national interest, according to me. And pursuit of national interest is a continuous process. It requires a fair bit of negotiation, fair bit of diplomacy, fair bit of work behind the scenes. And, you know, moving with social media comments, Truth Social, Twitter, etc., is not the best way. But that has become a hallmark today of U.S. diplomacy. And we've seen that not just with India, we've seen that with so many other countries.
Ambassador, you're speaking to me in very diplomatic terms, which shouldn't come as a surprise given your illustrious diplomatic career. But let's just go into the details of that change you've described between the perception in India of President Trump between January and the present day. You've said things have changed. Have they changed dramatically or only ever so slightly?
I would say there is a shift in perception. However, again, if I go back to drivers, fundamental structural drivers, I do maintain that there is going to be an India-US relationship after Trump and after Modi. So, and that relationship will come back to what the structural drivers of the India-US relationship are. And these are geopolitical drivers. If the US is, I do not think that the US is going to disengage from the Indo-Pacific.
Have we hit a low point?
At the same time, sorry?
Have we hit a low point, would you say, looking at the last 10 years? Would you say this is the lowest things have got to?
Yes, in a sense, because the trajectory since, let us say, the Kargil War, 1999, I would say the previous low point was when India and Pakistan tested in 1998. And the US imposed pretty severe sanctions on us. However, things started moving, and at that time, there was a dialogue that was carried out by Deputy Secretary Stroke Talbot, who was nominated by President Clinton, and on the Indian side by Jaswant Singh, who was the late Jaswant Singh, who was the foreign minister. Now, this, but the legacy of that was handed over to the next incoming Bush administration, which took it and carried it forward. And I know that Dr. Condoleezza Rice was personally very committed, both as NSA in the first term and then in the second term as Secretary of State. On the Indian side, it got handed over from Prime Minister Vajpayee to Dr. Manmohan Singh. It again got handed over from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, and then subsequently from in India from Dr. Manmohan Singh to Prime Minister Modi. And it has continued on a positive trajectory. Sometimes the trajectory has been moving up more sharply, and sometimes it has moved a little more slowly, but it has been a positive trajectory. And the optics have been positive right through. Now, this time around, the optics have turned. Now, I do not think personally that the optics will change the basic character of the relationship. At least I don't think so, having worked on India-US relationship for more than 15 years during my career.
Okay, I mean, we talk about the optics. I mean, one of the takeaways from the summit in China was a photograph of President Putin holding hands with your Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. I mean, what's the message they're sending to the rest of the world, do you think?
Well, President Putin is a past master at this kind of messaging. I mean, the fact that he waited for 10 minutes, this, I don't know if your audience knows this, but there was a bilateral meeting after the SEO meeting, and that was taking place at President Putin's hotel. And then he said that he would like Prime Minister Modi to travel with him in his limousine. And then, but Prime Minister Modi had a meeting, So there are these wonderful optics that he waited for 10 minutes while Prime Minister Modi finished his meeting so that they could travel together and have a one-on-one conversation during the drive. And even after they reached the hotel, media reports that the conversation continued, and it's only after that that the car doors were opened and they came out. So I think all this is optics. Well, the fact is we have had a close relationship with Russia, and there is no reason that people would not want to see a reassertion of this proximity at this particular point in time.
I mean, there were people in Washington.
When you have Navarro describing the Ukraine war in a gross exaggeration, calling it Modi's war, or calling India, a laundromat for Putin's oil income and things like that.
Sure. And I mean, I was just, reading some comments made by veteran American diplomats who say that the tariffs that President Trump has imposed on India have had one very simple effect, which is to push India right into the arms, the open arms of China and arguably Russia as well. What would you say to that?
Well, I can tell you that, like me, the American diplomats who said this are people who have spent years doing hard work, negotiating patiently with their Indian counterparts in terms of building the structure of this relationship. And so obviously they feel somewhat disappointed that that the geopolitical drivers of the relationship are being ignored and personalities are coming into play. And that's why they are saying this. And to an extent, I think there is an apprehension, but at the same time, I'm equally conscious that there are certain fundamental structural drivers of the India-China relationship. During our recent 4-day conflict with Pakistan, for the first time, it became clear that the Chinese were providing them with real-time intelligence and imagery, satellite imagery. They were guiding them, which was guiding them in terms of using their beyond visual range missiles and radars and things like that. So if we are looking at India-China relationship, first and foremost, as I mentioned at the outset, the boundary remains an outstanding issue. We have disengaged, but we have not de-escalated. We still have 50,000 soldiers on the line of actual control, as does China, looking at each other face to face.
Indeed, and I mean,
we also have growing evidence of the China relationship with Pakistan. We have growing concerns about Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. So it is not as if our relationship with China can be turned over and suddenly become a friendly, trusting relationship. The fact that Prime Minister Modi went to Japan before going to Tianjin has its own messaging, incidentally.
Sure. I mean, the fact that also participating at the SCO in China, you mentioned Pakistan, well, they had representation there as well. I mean, do you think we could describe all of this as Prime Minister Narendra Modi embracing what you might describe as pragmatic multilateralism? Is that how you'd describe this?
Well, certainly. I mean, there will have to be an element of pragmatic multilateralism. We have always maintained that we are moving towards a multipolar system. And now, the difficulty is that our own neighbor today has become a superpower, namely China. See, when we started on the road to improving relations with China way back in 1988, when then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi went and met to China and went and met Deng Xiaoping. And it was agreed that we should manage the boundary and put it on the back burner for the time being while developing trade, economy, people-to-people contacts, and other aspects of our relationship. At that time, the Indian GDP was about $200 $98 billion, and the Chinese GDP was $310 billion, roughly equal. Our defense budget, both our countries had defense budgets which were about $10 to $11 billion annual. China's growth trajectory has been much faster than ours. And gradually the gap has been growing, obviously, in China's favor. And today, if India says it's a $4 trillion economy, the Chinese are over 18 trillion. If India has a defense budget of $80 billion, China has a defense budget of 300 billion. So the parity that existed at the point when we went into this, putting the problem on the back burner, is that ground reality has shifted. And therefore, we have to find a new modus vivendi with China. And meanwhile, China, as I suppose befitting its position as the second largest economy and so on, and is wanting to expand its area of influence. And how does India deal with it, or how does that rub up against India, particularly when with India's adversary, Pakistan, China has the closest of ties. So there are some fundamental difficulties in terms of the long-term. It doesn't mean that we are going to go and have a fight with China. No, but there will be certain limitations as we manage our relationship with China in a stable fashion.
Okay, and just lastly, just to sort of wrap up this conversation and casting our eye back to Tianjin and that encounter today, I mean, does it look to you like we were looking there at the beginning of the end of what's been the US-dominated international order, which has really been in place since the end of the Second World War? I mean, is that how it looks to you? And some might point to divisions in the West, you know, the Europeans on one side, the Americans sort of taking a different route. I mean, is that what we're looking at here, a path from perhaps which there's no return?
Well, I think that the US-led order has been in a process of decline roughly, I would say, since 2008-9. And I say there are a couple of reasons. I mean, you had Afghanistan, you had Iraq, you had these two misadventures. And then you also had the financial crisis of 2008, and that then that has expanded. And it coincided, if you think about it historically, it coincided with China beginning its period of assertiveness. The first sign of that was the 9-dash line in the South China Seas, which came about during Hu Jintao's time. And then we've seen a more assertive Xi Jinping take over in 2012. It is roughly around that time that our boundary on the line of actual control became more active, first in 2013, 14, 17 at Doklam, then 2020, and so on. We also saw the growing concerns in Moscow about the NATO expansion. And therefore, in 2014, Russia taking over Crimea, and so on. So we have seen a gradual decline in the so-called US-led order. Mind you, during the Cold War, the US-led order was not global. It only existed insofar as the Western world was concerned. It didn't exist insofar as Soviet Union and East Europe and that bloc was concerned. So it is only in a short period that that US-led order was attempting to become a global order, which began with the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. So it had a relatively short shelf life, I would say.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, but we really appreciate you speaking to us. Ambassador Rakesh Sood, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir. Well, let's get more analysis. We can speak now to Dr. Sajan Gohel, who is the International Security Director at the Asia Pacific Foundation and a visiting teacher at the London School of Economics. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. There are some people in Washington who are concerned looking at the Indian Prime Minister there in China, looking like perhaps he's entering the orbit of China and Russia and pivoting away somewhat from the United States. What do you say to that?
Well, there has been this concern that as trade talks between the United States and India were reaching an impasse, that the fact that the Trump administration opted to go public in its social media commentary about that seemed to not necessarily produce the desired results. Now, the fact that the U.S. adopts that approach is not necessarily new with the Trump administration. They did it during the first term. It's definitely been amplified more. In many ways, it's a strategy, but it's not necessarily producing the desired results because I think for India, like with China, these are countries that prefer to do the negotiating behind closed doors rather than airing it openly. Now, Prime Minister Modi was most probably likely going to Tianjin for the SCO summit in any case, but it's had more significance as a result of this impasse between the US and India.
Okay, would you say tariffs are the only issue, or are there other irritants, would you say, in the relationship between New Delhi and Washington right now?
Well, if you look at the fact that since Bill Clinton went to India just before his second term ended, there was this massive strategic pivot towards India by various U.S. administrations across the political divide. So George W. Bush, Barack Obama, President Trump himself during his first term, and then President Biden, all of them sought this pivot to India to do with the Indo-Pacific strategy, of which India was a key element. What seems to have perhaps changed now is that under the second Trump administration, they are focusing on trade. That seems to be the primary aspect, perhaps even more important for them than the Indo-Pacific aspect. And that is where tensions have emerged, especially to do with tariffs and also the aspect about India purchasing Russian oil. It's very interesting that just a few hours ago, President Trump actually put out a message on his Truth Social talking about that his frustration was that India wasn't buying enough American oil as opposed to Russian oil. And I think that's what it ultimately stems for. The Russia aspect seems to be a misnomer. It's more about the bilateral trade that the U.S., especially the Trump administration, wants from India. But perhaps the way they're going about it isn't necessarily going to produce the desired results.
And do you think Prime Minister Modi sitting there in China at that event, listening to a speech by the President of China in which President Xi Jinping talked about the chaotic global international situation, he also talked about the bullying antics of certain countries, how much of a chord do you think that will have struck with him?
Well, the fact of the matter is that India and China have had tensions, especially over the border. They have 3 points of contention in their border dispute. Each one has on occasions turned into a small conflict, the last one being during the pandemic in 2020. And what you saw was a cold frostiness between both countries where people-to-people ties was cut, direct flights was stopped. Trade was also impacted. India banned social media from China like TikTok. What is perhaps now happening is the early steps to seeing if that relationship can improve. Those fault lines that still exist on the border will remain. I think for China, they would naturally want India to move away from that Indo-Pacific pivot that the U.S. has been wanting. And it's kind of interesting that we've already seen the U.S. reacting to Prime Minister Modi's trip to China. The U.S. Embassy in India actually put out a tweet on X with the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that the India-U.S. relationship is one of the most important. So you're seeing a kind of a varied commentary by the Trump administration, and it'll be interesting what more comes out of this in the coming days.
So from what you're saying, it sounds as though perhaps Prime Minister Modi's calculation was right, and appearing in pictures, holding hands, I should add, with the president of Russia, has somehow sent a message to Washington, and it seems to have been a message that's received and understood. Is that roughly what you're saying?
Well, look, the optics are obviously going to be important in conveying a message. And keep in mind that India has a long-standing relationship with Russia that hasn't begun just during or before the Ukraine war. This is going back generations. When Russia in its previous guise as the Soviet Union, there was a strategic relationship between Russia and India. India continues to purchase a huge amount of defense equipment from Russia. So that aspect hasn't necessarily changed. It's perhaps got, again, more focus because of the tensions with the U.S. China and Russia definitely want India to move further away from that pivot that the U.S. has been advocating. And I think it's up to the U.S. now to try and resolve some of the tensions that have emerged, because the fact is that India is being penalized for purchasing Russian oil, which the Biden administration in the first place had encouraged India to do because it put a price cap on it. And that wasn't seen as a violation, but it actually was designed as an attempt to prevent oil prices from rising.
You haven't mentioned the tensions between India and Pakistan, and so I'll bring that into the conversation now, because at the time, and we're talking now 3-4 months ago, President Trump claimed quite a lot of credit for having brokered a solution to that standoff between India and Pakistan. I'm just wondering how you think that crisis has changed the dynamic in relations between New Delhi and this second Trump administration.
Well, the Pahalgam terrorist attack that occurred in Indian-administered Kashmir definitely triggered a problem and a crisis, because India then reacted by targeting terrorist camps in Pakistan belonging to the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed, and we then saw tit-for-tat strikes from both countries. Now, there has been huge debate about the role that the Trump administration played in this. Pakistan is giving the U.S. credit for reducing tensions. India is not. India believes that it was a bilateral dialogue between both India and Pakistan that resolved this. Pakistan nominated President Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. India hasn't done the same thing. Now, we've also seen that as a result of that, Pakistan has entered into trade ties with the U.S. over oil exploration, which a lot of people are skeptical about because they've looked at that oil off the coast of Balochistan and in the past, and it's never been found. Natural rare earth minerals also, again, countries like China have spent a huge amount of time trying to find that in Pakistan to no avail. So there has been trade ties and improvements between Pakistan and the United States, but the fine print is yet to establish whether there's anything substantial that will come out of it. India, of course, remains to be resolved between the U.S. in terms of trade. There is perhaps hope that there still remains a window for both countries to resolve this situation. But what I think doesn't help is when you have people tied to the Trump administration like Peter Navarro going on the media, making public criticisms, making comments that are viewed as very incendiary inside India. For example, Peter Navarro said very recently that the oil that India is buying is only benefiting Brahmins. Now, that is a caste-based remark that is also difficult to understand because Prime Minister Modi is not a Brahmin, and nor are any of the senior members of the Indian government. So it's unclear who he's referring to, but it's nevertheless going to add an unnecessarily spoke to what has become a protracted situation between both countries.
I know you're not in India right now, but what is your sort of overall opinion of how the Indian public view the Trump administration? Because an opinion poll back in January suggested that the Indian public were amongst the most optimistic people in the world with regards to the return to the White House of President Donald Trump. How do you think they feel now?
Well, it's a good question. You are right that Trump was viewed favorably in India in the start of this year, and there was bon harmony between both Prime Minister Modi and President Trump during Trump's first term. But things seem to have changed. I think there has been a shock in India as to how the U.S. has reacted to the impasse in trade negotiations. I don't think it's necessarily that it's turned hostile. I think there's more confusion as to what's occurred. And the thing is that with the Trump administration, they can play what is, I guess, a page out of the art of the deal of President Trump's tactics for negotiating. And it can then lead from highs to lows and back and forth. So if this gets resolved soon, then I think opinions may well change again. But we'll have to watch this space.
Okay, so were you to give advice to the Trump administration on how to rectify the situation with India, bearing in mind those pictures we've seen from China where Prime Minister Narendra Modi is very welcome at the table with Presidents Xi and Putin, what would your advice be?
I think the starting point is that have those direct conversations with Prime Minister Modi and also try and aim to do it off social media and off the gaze of the media itself and do it privately. And perhaps then actual progress can probably be attained.
So I'm detecting from you there is an irritation in Delhi, or at least your perception is there's an irritation in Delhi at the public nature in which diplomacy is being carried out by this administration. Is that what you're saying?
Well, look, I can't speak for another country or another government as to how they look at it. But if you, as a neutral observer, if you look at the optics of how things have transpired in the last couple of months, it has led to uncertainty in the diplomatic ties. It's created a sense of frustration, I think, from both sides as to what is required. Keep in mind that India's 50% tariffs are on par with a country like Brazil. President Lula of Brazil does not have a good personal relationship with President Trump. President Trump preferred his predecessor, former President Bolsonaro. In the case of India, there is that good relationship that has existed between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. They haven't publicly criticized each other even during this crisis. So there still remains that possibility to resolve this. But of course, the longer this drags on, the more uncertain those ties will actually be. And we don't know also what is the U.S. focus when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. That has very much gone up in the air. So if you factor in things like the Quad, which is the U.S, India, Australia, and Japan, this is the four nations that are meant to be dealing with the Indo-Pacific challenges. The future of the Quad is also being questioned. And then there's a Quad Leaders Summit that is supposed to be in India later this year. Will President Trump go to that? All these things are going to be important to ascertain.
Okay, well, we really appreciate your analysis. As ever, a pleasure talking to you. Dr. Sajan Gohal, thank you for your time, sir.
My pleasure.
Well, for more on this, we can cross to Beirut and speak to the Lebanese MP, Dr. Marwan Hamadeh, who joins us now. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. You are, of course, a Lebanese politician and journalist. You've worked with L'Orient Le Jour and Le Point. You've also served in a number of ministerial roles, amongst them Minister of Education, Telecommunications and Health. You've had a long career and there's lots to talk about, but I'd like to start by asking you, how do you rate the progress of this new administration led by President Joseph Aoun and his team? Does it feel like your country has turned the corner?
بكل تأكيد كانت
It goes without saying that the process that has been initiated by this government and the ministerial statement has driven Lebanon to move into a new chapter, the chapter of having the state's monopoly over arms and sovereignty. We have failed in achieving this over many decades and through cascading ministries. And on each occasion, we were just confronted with assassination or acts of violence, and sometimes we were confronted with foot-dragging and intended procrastination, which led to the non-implementation of the Taif Accord or the Lebanese constitutions, along with the international resolutions, as well as the Ba'abda declaration that has been issued with the approval of Hezbollah. Yet on the following day, they said that it is what it is, and we will not just go to implement it. Today, we are at a very important crossroads. This week is very instrumental. We have a new cabinet session where the army will just roll out their strategy for the implementation of Hezbollah disarmament, and whether there will be some geographical areas where this disarmament will take place, along with the timeline, or otherwise this project will remain uncertain. And again, we will go back to the request of the Speaker of the Lebanese Parliament, Mr. Nabih Berri, who has been advocating for a national dialogue on the mutual defense, or what he called national security. In other words, he is just reiterating the same fact that arms cannot be restricted, and it will only be just with two parties. This decision will be made on Friday. Last week, there was some kind of progress where the Security Council has given us 1.5 years for the UNIFIL to have their mandate extended. Hopefully, the south of Lebanon will be liberated from Israel on the first hand, and from the hegemony of Hezbollah that has been taking control of that geography. And at the same time, we can see that the process started from the Palestinian camps, where they surrendered their arms. And this could send a first signal that will not be completed unless we have other factions, not only from Fatah, and here I mean Hamas, and other factions such as the Popular Movement, Democratic Movement, and other minor groups. On the first hand, we can say that we have achieved some progress, but there is still also some dragging on, and we have a sense of anticipation following the visit of Tom Barak's without any certain response from Israel on the proposal that we have already endorsed. Mr. Barak left Beirut, as you are aware, and in view of the statements that we have been hearing from Sheikh Naim Qasim, Hezbollah chief, based on his statement, there is a complete silence, complete blackout from Washington, as if they are saying that if you fail to resolve this issue with Hezbollah through Nabih Berri or without him, and to create an atmosphere of consensus so that arms could be just handed over and not disarmed, as the situation just happened with other former militias. And I myself was a member in the committee of handing over arms, and we just managed to have the Amal movement surrender its arms that has been exported abroad. Now the question remains whether Hezbollah will surrender their arms. Are they going to coordinate with the army so that they can give them the opportunity to take over of those areas? If they fail to do so, then we have two scenarios: either the erosion of confidence in the Lebanese government, as it will be failing just to stand up to this challenge, or alternatively, we are, may God forbid, might face a new cycle of violence with Israel, and then the continuous bombardments on the outskirts of Beirut and also in the southern area. Everything will be determined just during this week. So fingers crossed that the statement of Speaker Barry would not be a kind of just misleading and intended just to drag on the situation. And I mean that they will not just let Hezbollah surrender their arms. We know that the Shiite are present everywhere in the judiciary, in the government. It is not a component that has been deprived of their rights, as some people claim, since the days of Imam Musa Sadr. Today, the Shia components are a fundamental part of the Lebanese community. But they have to abide with the Ta'if Accord and the National Pact. In other words, that we have to establish a state control over arms.
Okay, Dr. Hamadeh, you made some very important points there, and I'd like to move the conversation on. Looking backwards, a tumultuous decade for Lebanon. Perhaps we can look back now 5 years, because the 5-year anniversary of the Beirut port blast was only last month, and that prompted your resignation from the government. And I want to ask you, who do you blame for the Beirut port blast, and are we any closer to finding the truth?
أنا كنت من أول المستهدفين.
I was one of the most targeted people in the series of assassinations that has tragically killed the former Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, along with other colleagues and other security personnel. So the blame is to be pinned on the shoulders of Hezbollah. Even the resolution that was passed by the International Court was clear. Salim Ayyash, and with the orders he received, has managed to carry out this assassination. All the investigations that were conducted afterwards have assigned the blame on Syria. And Syria, and we're not talking about the Syria under the rule of the Assad. They have been an accessory to this crime. But the perpetrator who carried out those crimes and also led to the invasion of Beirut in 2008, and also by starting a war with Israel in 2006, which eventually led to the toppling of governments continuously. So they have taken control of the government institutions in full. That situation has remained in place until the fatal mistake that has been committed by Hezbollah. We told them that they have not to be involved in this process. And I'm talking about the Gaza war here. It is a game of nations, and Lebanon cannot afford really to be a part of that. Yet, with orders from the Islamic Republic of Iran, they have waded into the situation, and unfortunately we have been defeated by the destruction of very precious parts of Lebanon and putting the southern part of Lebanon in shambles, the matter which deepened the economic crisis. And due to those reckless policies that we could see at times in Syria and at other times in Yemen, here we are now. We are totally bankrupt. We are in a complete state of danger, but yet we have an opportunity now that has been seized well by the government, and I think it's time just to hold on to this opportunity without, of course, rushing into any likely civil war, nor to just be subjected to blackmail of a civil war. This process and this scenario has brought the demise of many governments in the past that have failed to stand up to those realities, for example, led to the explosion of Beirut port. That was a tragic event and came as a result of storing explosive devices that have been used also against the Syrian people. So those reckless adventures by Iran and its militia Hezbollah, and also hand in hand with Syria under the rule of Assad, all of those are just history. Today, Lebanon is facing a new reality, either just to seize this opportunity and choose to come to the fold of the Arab countries, the peaceful Arab countries that are seeing greater opportunities in the region to come out of this hell that we are living now in every spot, starting from Iraq, Yemen, Sudan, Libya, you name it. The list is too long. And also in Syria and Lebanon and Palestine. What we are seeing in Gaza today is, frankly speaking, is something really precarious. We don't want just to bring this to Lebanon, the same scenario, maybe to Beirut, not only to the southern part of Lebanon. Maybe Beirut itself could be a target, as was the case in 2006. And also back in 1982, when Israel almost came to the outskirts of Beirut.
Okay, you've again made some very important points, and you mentioned Syria a number of times there. And I want to ask you, because you're someone who's had decades of dealings with Syria, most notably during the rule of President Bashar al-Assad and his father, a rule that lasted half a century. Clearly, the relationship between Lebanon and Syria is very different today. How do you characterize the state of ties now between Beirut and Damascus?
يعني ما في شك إنه العلاقة لا تزال معقدة.
It goes without saying that the relationship between Syria and Lebanon is still complex, and this is attributed to the challenges facing Syria today. Yet, with the liberation of Syria from the rule of Assad, now we have a window of opportunity in case there is just a good intention by the Syrian government, as the case by the Lebanese government, to resolve the sticking issues such as the demarcation of borders. As they have been just put out just 100 years ago, and also to resolve the contentious issue of Shaba farms. It is an occupied Arab land, and we believe we have to embark on the demarcation of borders, to control those borders, and Syria today has made just important strides in order to prevent the Persian incursions to the eastern part of Syria that began initially from Iraq, and even Jordan. Jordan has shown resilience, but Lebanon, we in Lebanon have to remember that the leaders of Tehran were gloating over the fact that they take control of 5 Arab capitals, including Damascus, starting from Sana'a and other cities, and therefore now it's over. In Syria there are just many challenges, and we are trying just with our people in Syria and with the new government of Syria to make some progress at the different fronts at the economic level, and with the generous support of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf regions at large. So Syria started just to have a breathing room, but there is a heavy legacy that has been just suffocating the Syrian people by Hafiz al-Assad and his son. Bashar al-Assad has just given Syria to Iran on a golden platter, and from there we could see the mafias that started the Captagon drugs cycles that shattered the country. So it is a great opportunity now in order to reach into a reasonable solution in terms of the southern borders and the water issues, and let alone the distinguished relationship between Syria and Lebanon that would take both countries eventually to come to the fold, to the Arab states and to the Gulf region. And those are neighboring countries. At a time when we have been deserted by everyone, we could see that the U.S. is trying to broker some kind of peaceful negotiations, and we are still hopeful that this government is resilient yet decisive in making its own decisions. And that is to say, to have a monopoly over arms by the state. And this could pave the way for economic prosperity, full sovereignty, and we could just play our role as a leading example in the eastern part of the Arab region. We have been kidnapped over the last 30 years by the follies of some leaders, and that's why this week could be vital and instrumental, where Lebanon will be having an acid test to achieve a breakthrough. Hopefully, the real intentions of the leaders will be materialized. Today, we have this test of the Tariff Accord, which will remain the backbone and the light at the end of the tunnel. Okay. I still remember that this accord has been foiled by a conspiracy that was carried out by the Syrian regime, Iran, and the Israeli aggression as well.
Dr. Hamadeh, let's go back to talking about Hezbollah for a moment, because a couple of weeks ago you told the news channel Al-Hadat that Lebanon will not be threatened, you said, by Naim Qassem, the head of Hezbollah, this in regards to Hezbollah giving up its weapons. How long do you think this dialogue to persuade Hezbollah to give up its weaponry is going to take? And how is the Lebanese army going to achieve this?
So we are talking about the Lebanese armed forces here. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
What I would like to stress here is that the rhetorics of Naim Qassem will never intimidate us. It is important for me and for all the patriotic people of Lebanon is to have their resolve solid in making the decisions backed by Arab countries. And by the way, I have just heard the statement that was released an hour ago from the Gulf Cooperation Council, who have supported the Lebanese government's move to establish a monopoly over arms across Lebanon. This also a clear signal for supporting Lebanon. And in other words, Hezbollah does not have the right to tell us go back to dialogue, and they can just start foot dragging and procrastinating in order to have some political gains. They don't have the right to do that. I told you this. Hezbollah or the Shiite components are present in the cabinet, in various state institutions, and they have no grievances at all. And I think if there has been any kind of grievances, then it could have impacted other components as a result of assassination. We cannot forget what Lebanon has been through the Syrian tutelage and guardianship, and especially the Persian attack that has become unconscionable. And now we can see just any Iranian minister of the first class or the 10th class visiting Lebanon and barking orders on the government of Lebanon of what to do. And that's what happened during the era of Michel Aoun. What the masters of Tehran wanted just to do, they used just to back those orders on us.
Okay, and just when you look back at some of the events of the last year, obviously we're nearly a year away from the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the former head of Hezbollah. We're less than a year since the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, the leader of Syria. What's your reaction to these tumultuous events? Do you sometimes have difficulty believing what's happened, especially because a lot of this has been very personal to you, and you may believe that Hezbollah and Syrian forces were behind attempts to assassinate you and many people around you. What's your feeling?
I
stated that on more than one occasion, and allow me just to repeat it again. When fairness is absent, and I mean here the fairness of the International Tribunal and the fairness on this earth, then maybe we had a divine fairness. And all those who just took part in the assassination seem to have faced the same destiny, and especially the leaders of the 14th of March and leaders in Lebanon and those who supported independence. All of them have perished. Yet it saddens us deeply that I hope that they have brought to justice and appeared before the courts, instead of having a U.S. French-Israeli operations starting from Ahmad Mughniya, Mustafa Badruddin and others, to name a few, where there were some kind of score settling that started with the Marines camp, and we had the French air forces, let alone the foiled assassination attempt against the Emir of Kuwait then. And therefore, within 2 months, the whole situation has changed upside down. As I said, it saddens us that this change has to come by Israel. But honestly, we were delighted with the toppling of the Assad regime, and Lebanon has sent a delegation to Damascus, and I think it was the first delegation. I myself have not visited Syria since 2004 when I was the Minister of Economy. And at that time I was heading to Damascus International Fair because there was the assassination attempt and the frequent other attempts that followed. Now, visiting Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque, Ghouta have really warmed my heart. It was really a blissful day for us because it's a good riddance of this heinous regime.
Okay, and just lastly, I want to ask you, because you worked as a close advisor to Walid Jumblat, and you were there with him last Tuesday when the U.S. envoy Tom Barak was in town. I just want to ask you, there's been some controversy and some anger in Lebanon and in the Arab world about some of the comments that were made by Tom Barak. What do you think of the polemic?
يعني طبعا في آخر اجتماع مع توم باراك
In the last meeting held with the U.S. envoy Tom Barak, there was just a dinner that was organized following the official meeting that was held at Mr. Walid Jumblad's place, where we discussed the situation in Syria and those attempts of separating Syria. We are supporting Syria's coming back to the fold of the Arab states, and with that, Syria has to rely on moderate approach and fairness. That was one of the topics broached, and Tom Barak was giving assurances to the Lebanese president about the situation in Syria. In Lebanon, we have to state that the U.S. proposal that was dubbed as it has become more of Lebanese nature after the objectives have been stated, has not received any response yet from Israel. As if Israel said, and this is what Tom Barak said, is that implementation is what matters about placing the arms under the control of the state. And the Arab world has been hearing frequently from Lebanese leaders something on the same lines, like just down the road there will be sovereignty and the Lebanese armed forces will have full control of arms. But this time around, the situation is different. Tom Barak somehow has been blaming the Lebanese government. I think maybe he was venting his anger, but his comments were not really quite positive, especially with the journalist. And he himself explained what happened and extended an apology about what he said, explaining that he was so stressed out at that moment. I think this is something very minimal, but we have to know what will be the fate of the U.S. proposal. Would it lead to the withdrawal of the Israeli forces from the 5 occupied points, exchange of prisoners, and also to have just demarcated borders that aligns with the truths that have been set out by Britain and France 105 years ago? The other question is, are we honest, are we sincere, and do we have the intention to implement the arms monopoly? I think everyone is having an acid test, the Lebanese government, along with the overwhelming majority of the Lebanese people. All of us do firmly believe that Hezbollah issue cannot remain the dilemma, because this will bring Lebanon on its knees. We have to salvage Lebanon from them and for their sake. We have also to rescue them from what they have been involved with. The second test, which is a test for the United States and also for the guarantors of this U.S. proposal. And the last test, which we have no control over that, is that we have to understand to what extent the Israeli government is going with this radical approach and across the board in terms of the two-state solution, and annexing just the West Bank, and also by removing and displacing the population of Gaza. I think the bloodiest suffering in the world is what we see in Gaza. It is a test for Lebanon, a test for the United States and for Israel. We have the back of Arab countries, and Saudi Arabia has been on our side. They have told us more than one time, just get rid of this cancer and then you will have the remedy from us. And they will help us with healing us. But if we have just to get funds for economy and for the army, then we have to liberate ourselves from this hegemony and this blackmail that lasted for more than 30 years, and mainly because of Tehran.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Dr. Marwan Hamadeh, thank you very much indeed for your time, so we really appreciate it. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.